Brian Knobbs is over 60. Where is he now? If you've ever wondered what happened to Brian Knobbs now that he's over 60, the truth might break your heart. Life hasn't been kind to him lately. He's battling serious health problems that would crush most people, and on top of that, he's facing a tough financial situation. So let's dive in and see what really went wrong for the former wrestling star. Knobbs' journey into wrestling began in the mid-1980s, when the sport was booming with over-the-top characters and colorful storylines. Alongside his close friend Jerry Saggs, he formed the Nasty Boys, a team that would come to define a certain kind of brawling, no-rules wrestling. They weren't polished like the Rockers or technical like the Hart Foundation. They were street fighters, messy, loud, and completely unpredictable. The duo first started making noise in the American Wrestling Association. At a time when tag team wrestling was stacked with talent, the Nasty Boys stood out simply because they didn't care about looking pretty. They came to fight, and they didn't care who they offended. Their wild brawls caught fans' attention, and soon enough, promoters across the country wanted to see what kind of chaos they could bring to their shows. By 1990, the Nasty Boys had signed with the World Wrestling Federation, and that's where Brian Knobbs' career truly exploded. From the moment they appeared on WWF television, you knew they were different. They wore bright, graffiti-style gear, leather jackets, and sunglasses, and they carried themselves like street punks who had wandered into a wrestling ring by accident. But there was no act. That was who they were. Their loud energy instantly made them fan favorites to hate. They didn't play by the rules, they didn't care about sportsmanship, and they loved to get under people's skin. Their interviews were filled with shouting, growling, and in-your-face bravado. Brian Knobbs especially stood out. His raspy voice, wild expressions, and unpredictable energy made him feel like a walking storm. The peak of their WWF run came in 1991 at WrestleMania 7, one of the most memorable nights of Knobbs' career. The Nasty Boys faced the Hart Foundation, one of the best tag teams of all time, for the WWF Tag Team Championship. Against all odds, Knobbs and Saggs pulled off a shocking win, capturing the gold on wrestling's biggest stage. The image of Knobbs celebrating with the belts, screaming into the camera, became one of the most iconic moments of his career. It was a sign that the wild kids from the streets had made it to the top. That victory launched the Nasty Boys into the spotlight. They defended their titles against major teams like the Legion of Doom, the Rockers, and Money Inc. Every match felt like a street fight, with trash cans, fists, and chaos everywhere. They weren't the most technical team, but they were real. Their matches looked like fights you'd see in a back alley after Last Call, and that's exactly what made them entertaining. Fans might have booed them, but deep down, they loved the chaos. Behind the scenes, Knobbs built friendships with some of wrestling's biggest stars, especially Hulk Hogan. The two shared a similar love for wild parties, loud laughter, and living life to the fullest. That friendship would later play a big part in Knobbs' post-wrestling life, but during the early 90s, it simply added to his larger-than-life image. He wasn't just a wrestler, he was part of the wildest group of guys in the business. In 1993, the Nasty Boys left WWF and joined World Championship Wrestling. For many wrestlers, changing companies could be risky, but for Knobbs, it was just another adventure. WCW's atmosphere fit the Nasty Boys perfectly. The company was filled with big personalities, wild gimmicks, and plenty of room for brawlers like Knobbs and Saggs to shine. They quickly became a major force in WCW's tag team division, winning the WCW Tag Team Championships multiple times. Some of their most memorable matches came against teams like Harlem Heat and the Public Enemy. These matches weren't about clean holds or technical sequences. They were about mayhem. Tables broke, chairs flew, and fans went wild. Knobbs thrived in that kind of environment. Throughout the mid-90s, the Nasty Boys remained one of the most recognizable teams in WCW. They were part of big storylines, wild feuds, and unforgettable pay-per-view moments. And no matter how much time passed, their style stayed the same. Nasty, loud, and full of energy. Even when newer teams came along, the Nasty Boys still felt like the real deal. They brought an old-school toughness that never went out of style. By the late 1990s, as WCW evolved into the era of the New World Order and flashier entertainment, Knobs began to take on more of a personality role than an in-ring competitor. But he was never far from the action. Fans loved seeing him appear backstage, yelling into cameras or getting into brawls with other wrestlers. When WCW finally shut down in 2001, Knobs' days as a full-time wrestler were mostly behind him. But retirement was never really his thing. He continued to make appearances on the independent wrestling circuit, attend conventions, and show up at wrestling reunions. His wild energy and love for the business never faded. Outside of wrestling, Knobs stayed close to his best friend Hulk Hogan. He appeared on Hogan's reality show, Hogan Knows Best, and the spin-off Brooke Knows Best, often playing the role of the goofy, over-the-top friend who always found himself in ridiculous situations. Fans loved it because it was classic Brian Knobs. What you saw on TV was exactly who he was in real life. Even as the years went by, Knobs remained a beloved figure in wrestling circles. He was often invited to conventions and autograph signings where fans lined up to meet him and share their memories of the Nasty Boys. He'd tell stories, crack jokes, and pose for pictures with the same enthusiasm he had in his prime. For many fans, seeing Knobs still smiling and laughing was a reminder of wrestling's wilder days. A time when tag teams didn't just wrestle, they brawled. The Nasty Boys helped shape that part of wrestling history, bringing a sense of danger and fun that's still remembered decades later. But as the years rolled on, the wild energy that once made Brian Knobs a fan favorite slowly began to fade. Decades of brutal matches, long road trips, and hard living had left their mark. Behind the laughter and loud personality, Knobs' body was breaking down, and the toll of his wrestling career became impossible to hide. The first major sign of trouble came when he started struggling with serious pain in his knees. Years of slamming into concrete floors, taking chair shots, and diving through tables had destroyed his joints. The damage was so bad that doctors told him he needed surgery. For most people, knee surgery is tough, but for someone who had already pushed his body past its limits, it was life-changing. The recovery was slow and painful. Knobs could barely walk at times, and getting back to normal life wasn't easy. Even after the surgery, the pain never truly went away. His mobility became limited, and everyday tasks that once felt simple became exhausting. But that was only the beginning. Around the same time, Knobs was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, a condition that made everything worse. Managing blood sugar levels, dealing with nerve pain, and fighting fatigue became part of his daily routine. For a man who had always been larger than life, being forced to slow down was tough. Knobs was known for his energy, the way he'd shout into the camera, throw punches like a madman, and never stop moving. But now his body simply couldn't keep up. Diabetes also meant he had to be careful with even the smallest injuries, because infections could spread quickly. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened next. In 2021, Knobs' health took a frightening turn. He developed a severe infection in his leg that quickly spread through his body. Within days, he was hospitalized in critical condition. Doctors were deeply concerned, not only because of the infection itself, but because his diabetes made it much harder to treat. The infection grew worse, and there was real fear that it might reach his foot and force an amputation. For fans who grew up watching the Nasty Boys tear up arenas, the news was devastating. The once tough, unstoppable brawler was suddenly fighting for his life. Photos began circulating online of Knobs lying in a hospital bed, looking weak and frail. It was hard to believe this was the same man who used to storm down to the ring full of energy and attitude. As the reality of his condition spread, the wrestling community stepped up. Friends, former colleagues, and fans began organizing fundraisers to help cover his growing medical expenses. GoFundMe campaigns were launched to pay for hospital bills, medication, and rehabilitation. Knobs himself later admitted how grateful he was for the support. He said it reminded him that people still cared, even after all these years. But recovery was far from easy. The infection had damaged his leg badly, and doctors had to monitor him constantly to keep it under control. His mobility suffered even more, and he needed rehab to learn how to walk properly again. At times, he felt helpless, unable to do the simplest things without assistance. Still, he pushed through, refusing to give up. That same stubborn, never-say-die attitude that made him famous in the ring became the thing that kept him alive outside of it. However, the health issues weren't the only thing weighing on him. Medical bills piled up quickly, and Knobs soon found himself in serious financial trouble. Wrestling hadn't provided retirement plans or long-term health care back in his era, and the money he'd made during his prime had long been spent. He wasn't wrestling anymore, and convention appearances were rare because of his declining health. The man who once had crowds chanting his name was now struggling just to make ends meet. And then, as if fate hadn't already done enough, tragedy struck again. In 2024, Hurricane Milton hit Florida, the state Knobs called home. The storm tore through neighborhoods, leaving destruction everywhere. Among the many people affected were Brian Knobs and his wife. The hurricane destroyed their home completely, wiping out nearly everything they owned. Decades of memories, personal belongings, and keepsakes from his wrestling career were all gone in an instant. Reports surfaced that Knobs and his wife were left homeless after the disaster. They were forced to move between hotel rooms and rehabilitation facilities, relying on friends and fan donations to get by. Despite all the pain and loss, Knobs never completely lost his sense of humor or his fighting spirit. In interviews, he's spoken about how hard it's been, but also how grateful he is to still be alive. He often jokes that he's too nasty to quit, a line that perfectly sums up the fighter he's always been. Even when everything seemed hopeless, he found a way to keep going. And that wraps up today's video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories like this. We'll see you soon. Take care.